When Aerys II Targaryen first ascended to the Iron Throne, the realm did not yet call him the Mad King. He was young, handsome, and brimming with the kind of confidence that often inspires hope in a kingdom weary of political stagnation. His marriage to his sister Rhaegar was intended to strengthen the Targaryen bloodline, continuing a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries since the conquest. At first his reign promised to be a new dawn. Aerys spoke of reform, of rebuilding the glory of House Targaryen, and of surpassing his forebears in wisdom and might. He surrounded himself with notable figures, not least of which was his brilliant and pragmatic hand of the king, Tywin Lannister. This partnership seemed destined for greatness. The shrewd and disciplined Tywin balanced the impulsive and ambitious Aerys, and the Seven Kingdoms entered what could have been a long period of stability. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of instability had already been planted. Aerys' confidence often masked deep insecurities. Insecurities rooted in the heavy weight of his family's history, the expectations of the Iron Throne, and the traditions of incestuous marriage that had long plagued the Targaryen bloodline with whispers of madness. Even in his early years, those closest to him noticed flashes of paranoia and arrogance, small but unmistakable signs that Aerys saw both allies and enemies as potential threats to his authority. It is in this early period, before his paranoia spiraled into open tyranny, that the Targaryens could have intervened to avoid the catastrophe that lay ahead. One key strategy would have been to foster an environment in which Aerys felt secure rather than embattled. Much of his later cruelty and suspicion was born from an ever-growing fear that those around him were plotting against his reign. In the early days, with Tywin as his steadfast hand, there was a unique opportunity to cement trust and openness in the royal court. Instead of allowing small slights to fester, Aerys could have been encouraged to engage in councils that welcomed debate rather than stifling it. Tywin, known for his ability to command order, could have played a more direct role in curbing the king's impulsive decisions, not just through quiet counsel, but by instituting a political culture where disagreement with the king was not seen as treason. By normalizing dissent and ensuring that Aerys had a trusted circle unafraid to challenge him, the paranoia that would one day consume him might have been starved before it took root. The young king also had a chance to solidify his popularity with the common people early in his reign. Royal progress through the Seven Kingdoms, lavish public works, and just rulings in disputes between noble and small folk alike could have built a foundation of loyalty that would serve as a buffer against the later unrest. Aerys initially had the charisma to do this. When he wished to, he could be charming and magnanimous. However, without a concerted effort from those around him to encourage and expand on these moments, his better qualities were allowed to wither. The early years should have been dedicated to strengthening the bond between crown and realm, not merely relying on the Targaryen name to command respect. In truth, that name, while still formidable, no longer held the same untouchable reverence it once did. Robert's rebellion would prove. Another decisive opportunity lay in addressing the delicate matter of the Targaryen tradition of sibling marriage. Aerys' union with Rhaegar was marred by tragedy after tragedy, multiple stillbirths, miscarriages, and the loss of several young children. Each death deepened the king's paranoia and darkened his mood, but the connection between the constant personal grief and his eventual descent into madness cannot be overlooked. The royal family could have, even at this early stage, encouraged a marriage alliance outside of close kin to both strengthen political bonds and potentially temper the hereditary risks of instability. Marrying a daughter of a great house, for example, could have tied the Iron Throne to powerful allies in ways that would have made open rebellion far less likely decades later. Such a move would not only have strengthened the dynasty's political position, but might also have subtly addressed the undercurrent of mental fragility in the Targaryen bloodline. One of the most damaging traits to emerge in Aerys' early reign was his hunger for grandeur without the discipline to achieve it. He dreamed of massive building projects, military campaigns, and spectacles that would make his reign legendary. Yet without a clear sense of strategy, these ambitions became erratic and costly. Here too, the opportunity to avoid his eventual fall was present. By channeling these impulses into achievable and meaningful projects, restoring fortresses, improving roads, sponsoring trade routes, the crown could have satisfied Aerys' desire for glory, while simultaneously strengthening the realm's economy and defense. In this way, his reign might have been remembered for prosperity rather than paranoia, His relationship with Tywin Lannister in those first years was perhaps the most critical factor. Initially, it was one of mutual benefit. Tywin provided the stability and administrative skill that Aerys lacked, while Aerys provided the legitimacy and royal authority that Tywin needed to execute his vision. However, the seeds of their eventual falling out were already sprouting, nurtured by Aerys's growing jealousy over the respect Tywin commanded. Left unchecked, this jealousy became a source of division, eventually driving away the one man capable of tempering Aerys's excess. A deliberate and sustained effort by the royal family to reinforce the Hand's loyalty and to publicly honor his service could have kept this alliance strong. A king confident in his own authority should not have felt threatened by his Hand's reputation, but Aerys's insecurities magnified every perceived slight. The court could have worked tirelessly to reassure him that Tywin's glory was the crown's glory, preventing the fracture that would eventually weaken the realm's leadership. Another early intervention point involved the education and grooming of Prince Rhaegar. While Rhaegar was a deeply intelligent and capable man, the king often viewed his son with suspicion, particularly as whispers grew of Rhaegar's fitness to rule compared to his father. Rather than letting such suspicions breed resentment, the early years could have been spent shaping Rhaegar as a trusted partner in governance. Aerys could have elevated his son to meaningful positions of leadership, allowing him to build his reputation while demonstrating loyalty to his father. In this way, the succession could have been framed not as a threat to Aerys's rule, but as the natural continuation of his legacy. The truth is that the fall of the Mad King was not inevitable. The madness for which he is remembered was a gradual development, accelerated by years of unchecked power, personal tragedy, and deepening paranoia. In his early reign, Aerys II Targaryen still had the capacity for reason, charm, and even vision. The Targaryen dynasty still commanded enough respect to shape the political landscape of Westeros in its favor. By identifying and addressing the underlying sources of instability, through trust building in the court, strategic alliances, the wise management of ambition, and the careful nurturing of both the king's mental health and his heir's readiness, the Seven Kingdoms could have been spared the devastating civil war that followed. History remembers Aerys as a tyrant consumed by fire and blood, but there was a time when he could have been remembered as a reformer, a restorer of Targaryen greatness, and a bridge between the glorious past and a stable future. The tragedy of his reign lies not only in what he became, but in how preventable it all truly was had the right actions been taken when the signs first appeared. The seeds of madness were there from the start, but so too were the seeds of redemption. The failure to cultivate the latter ensured the fall of the Targaryens, and the rise of the fires that would consume King's Landing. The Targaryen dynasty's long-standing tradition of marrying brother to sister, cousin to cousin, had always been a double-edged sword. It was rooted in their ancient Valyrian customs, a practice meant to preserve the purity of their bloodline and their unique bond with dragons. From their perspective, it was not merely an act of politics or passion. It was an article of faith, a cornerstone of their identity. Yet the history of House Targaryen offered ample warnings of the dangers this tradition carried. Generations of such unions had produced rulers of sharp intellect and great power, but also those plagued by instability, cruelty, and obsession. When Aerys II wed his sister Rhaegar, the match seemed to follow centuries of precedent, but it also set in motion a chain of personal and political tragedies that would hasten the family's fall. The risks of inbreeding were not fully understood in Westeros in the way they might be in a modern context, but the Targaryens had already seen enough examples to know its potential consequences. Maegor the Cruel's brutality, King Aerys's paranoia, and the eccentricities of other rulers in their history were cautionary tales. Yet they clung to the belief that their Valyrian heritage placed them above the weaknesses of other men. The match between Aerys and Rhaegar had been arranged by King Jaehaerys II, not out of romance, but as a calculated measure to ensure the dynasty's magical and political uniqueness. What he could not foresee, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that this union would prove deeply unhappy and devastatingly unfruitful. From the start, Aerys and Rhaegar's marriage was marked by a series of personal losses that would scar them both. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and the deaths of infants followed one after another, each leaving wounds that never healed. Rhaegar, their firstborn to survive, was a bright light in an otherwise dark chapter of their lives, but the grief they endured shaped their personalities in ways that echoed through the court. Rhaegar retreated into a quiet resilience, enduring her husband's increasingly erratic moods in silence. Aerys, on the other hand, grew more volatile with every tragedy, seeking someone or something to blame. He turned his suspicion upon his wife, his court, and even the gods themselves. Each loss fed the paranoia that would one day define him, a paranoia made all the more dangerous when coupled with his absolute power. Avoiding the Mad King's fall would have required a radical break from this insular tradition of marriage. While it is true that marrying outside the family would have been seen by some as a betrayal of their Valyrian roots, it would also have opened the door to forging strong political alliances. Aerys himself, in his early years, might have benefited immensely from a queen drawn from one of the great houses of Westeros. Such a match would have not only diversified the Targaryen bloodline, potentially tempering the risk of inherited instability, but it would also have tied the Iron Throne to powerful regional loyalties. Imagine if Aerys had taken a bride from House Stark, binding the proud and honorable lords of the North to the Targaryen cause through marriage, or perhaps a lady from House Tyrell, with their vast wealth and influence in the Reach, could have been the key to steadying the realm's politics. A Lannister bride might have cemented an unbreakable alliance with Tywin, ensuring that his loyalty to the crown remained personal as well as political. Even a union with House Martell, already linked to the Targaryens through historical ties, could have brought a lasting peace between Dorne and the Iron Throne. Such matches were more than symbolic. They could have created webs of obligation and kinship that made rebellion not only costly but personally wrenching for the lords involved. There is also the question of heir. A marriage outside of close kin would likely have produced more robust children, free from the whispers of fragility and instability that plagued the royal nursery. While no union is immune to tragedy, the repeated heartbreak of Aerys and Rhaegar's childbearing years weighed heavily on the king's mind. The birth of healthy children, heirs in whom the king could take pride, might have been enough to soften his descent into paranoia. Aerys's obsession with legacy was one of his defining traits. Without the constant fear that his line would end, his reign could have taken a far steadier course. Breaking with tradition would not have been easy. Many Targaryens before Aerys had resisted calls to marry outside the family, convinced that their bloodline's purity was the source of their power and legitimacy. Some believed that to dilute it was to invite ruin. Yet the political reality of Westeros in Aerys's time was shifting. Dragons were long gone, the mystique of Valyria had faded, and the Targaryen name, while still respected, no longer inspired the awe it once did. In such a climate, clinging to an old custom at the expense of the realm's stability was more dangerous than the loss of tradition itself. Aerys's counselors, particularly Tywin, who understood the value of political marriage better than most, might have persuaded him to take a different course if they had acted early, before his paranoia took root. A new kind of queen, one trained in diplomacy, with powerful family ties, could have reshaped the royal court into a more harmonious and politically astute environment. She could have acted as a mediator between Aerys and his lords, tempering his rash impulses with a voice he trusted. A queen from outside the family might have softened the king's increasingly insular worldview, exposing him to perspectives beyond the narrow walls of the Red Keep. Where Rhaegar, through no fault of her own, became a symbol of Aerys's personal grief and frustration, a politically chosen bride might have stood as a symbol of unity between crown and kingdom. Furthermore, a broader bloodline could have altered the public's perception of the Targaryens at a crucial time. By the later years of Aerys's reign, the dynasty was seen as aloof, removed from the struggles of common folk, and consumed by its own internal drama. A queen with roots in the great noble houses, or even a respected lesser house, could have bridged this gap. Her presence would have reminded the realm that the Iron Throne belonged to all the seven kingdoms, not merely to one family's ancient claim. It is important to remember that Robert's rebellion, though sparked by the events involving Rhaegar and Lyanna, was fueled by years of accumulated resentment toward the crown. The rebellion's leaders, Robert Baratheon, Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn, were not bound to the Targaryens by marriage or kinship. Had they been, their personal loyalties might have complicated or even prevented the war. Aerys's isolation, both in blood and in politics, meant that when his madness became undeniable, few in the realm felt compelled to defend him. A different marriage policy could have ensured that in the hour of crisis, the king had allies bound to him by more than oath. The dangers of inbreeding were not only biological, but psychological. The insular nature of the Targaryen family encouraged a mindset that the outside world could not be trusted, that only those of their own blood could be relied upon. For a man like Aerys, already predisposed to suspicion, this mindset was a breeding ground for paranoia. A more outward-looking marriage policy might have challenged this insularity, forcing the royal family to engage more openly with the political realities of the realm. It could have introduced new voices, new loyalties, and new perspectives into the royal household, elements that might have acted as a counterweight to the king's darker impulses. Ultimately, the decision to maintain the tradition of inbreeding was one of the pivotal choices that set the stage for Aerys's downfall. It limited the dynasty's political alliances, contributed to personal tragedies that deepened the king's instability, and reinforced the isolation that would leave him vulnerable when rebellion came. Avoiding the Mad King's fall would have required courage not only in battle or governance, but in breaking with the very traditions that had defined Targaryen rule for centuries. To balance the bloodline was to balance the realm itself, and in failing to do so, the Targaryens ensured that when Aerys fell, he would fall alone. The small council of the Seven Kingdoms was never meant to be a gathering of flatterers or sycophants. In its ideal form, it was a body of the realm's wisest and most capable minds, tasked with guiding the king's hand and tempering his excesses. Composed of the hand of the king, the master of coin, the master of laws, the master of ships, the master of whisperers, the Grand Maester, and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. It was a forum where policy was debated, plans were refined, and the good of the realm was weighed against the will of the monarch. In theory, it was the most important safeguard against royal misrule, a balance of perspectives ensuring that one man's whims did not lead the kingdom into ruin. In practice, however, under Aerys II Targaryen, the council became less a brake on the king's power and more a theater in which his paranoia was performed. In the early years of Aerys's reign, the small council still functioned as intended. Tywin Lannister, as Hand, oversaw the realm's administration with ruthless efficiency, cutting through corruption and enforcing the king's decrees with an iron will. Varys, the master of whisperers, though he would arrive later in Aerys's reign, brought an unparalleled network of informants. The Grand Maesters provided counsel grounded in history and law, and the other lords of the council brought the interests of their respective domains to the table. This was the moment when decisive action could have been taken to safeguard the realm from the emerging signs of Aerys's instability. Yet the opportunity was squandered. Part of the problem was structural. In Westeros, the small council had no formal authority to overrule the king. Their power derived entirely from their ability to persuade. And persuasion relies on trust. As Aerys's paranoia deepened, his trust in the council eroded. Every disagreement was interpreted as a personal challenge to his authority. Every suggestion that contradicted his desires became in his mind an act of veiled treason. The small council's members, aware of the danger in provoking the king's wrath, began to temper their advice, softening their language, and in some cases, holding their tongues entirely. This erosion of honest counsel allowed Aerys's more dangerous ideas to pass unchallenged. If the Targaryens had truly wished to avoid the Mad King's fall, they would have needed to empower the small council to act decisively during these early warning signs. The first step would have been to strengthen the unity of its members. A council divided is easily manipulated by a king who plays factions against one another. Tywin Lannister, while unquestionably brilliant, was not a man who suffered rivals gladly. His dominance of the council sometimes alienated other members, fostering resentment rather than cohesion. The early reign could have been used to cultivate a culture of collective governance within the council, one where members understood that their influence was magnified when they spoke with one voice. Aerys could ignore one dissenting voice, but a united council presenting a single recommendation would have been far harder to dismiss outright. Another key change would have been the establishment of formal checks on the king's more impulsive action. While outright defiance of the monarch was unthinkable in Westerosi custom, it was possible to create procedural delays, requiring that certain decrees pass through a review by the Hand and the Master of Laws, or that major military or financial undertakings be approved by a majority of the council, would not have stripped Aerys of his authority, but would have slowed his descent into arbitrary decision-making. These measures would have to be framed carefully, perhaps as a way to protect the king's reputation or to ensure the proper execution of his vision, rather than as limitations on his power. The hand of the king, as the leader of the council, bore the greatest responsibility in this regard. Tywin Lannister's strengths were in administration and intimidation, but he was less adept at the subtle art of preserving a ruler's ego while quietly redirecting his will. If Tywin had been willing to play a longer game, using charm and concession to keep Aerys engaged rather than resorting to cold efficiency, he might have preserved both their working relationship and the council's influence. When Aerys began to view Tywin's growing prestige as a threat, the hand could have sought ways to publicly elevate the king's role in every success, ensuring that the court and the realm saw all victories as the king's triumphs, with Tywin merely the executor. The Master of Whisperers also had a role to play. Intelligence was Aerys's weakness. He relied heavily on the reports of those he trusted, and when paranoia took hold, he was easily swayed by whispers of betrayal. A loyal and principled Master of Whisperers could have filtered this information, shielding the king from rumors designed to inflame his fears while discreetly exposing him to truths that countered his suspicion. The council could have used such intelligence to anticipate the king's outbursts, intervening before rash decisions were made. A further opportunity for the council lay in managing the composition of its own membership. As Aerys's reign progressed, he increasingly appointed men who fed his paranoia or indulged his cruelty. This created an echo chamber, with no moderating voices left to temper his most destructive impulses. The royal family, had they wished to preserve stability, could have ensured that the council always included at least 2 or 3 members of unassailable loyalty to the realm itself, men or women respected by multiple factions of the nobility. Such figures could not be easily dismissed as enemies, making it harder for Aerys to isolate himself in a cocoon of sycophants. One of the gravest turning points came when the council failed to intervene decisively after Aerys's imprisonment during the Defiance of Dusk and Dale. That ordeal, being held hostage by Lord Denys Darkland for half a year, shattered what little trust the king retained in others. He emerged from captivity more suspicious, more vengeful, and more inclined toward cruelty. This was the moment for the council to act with firmness and compassion, framing the experience as a reminder of the need for unity and strong governance. Instead, they allowed the king's paranoia to dictate policy, leading to purges, executions, and the alienation of powerful houses. Had the council been more proactive, they could have offered Aerys a path toward reclaiming his dignity without resorting to vengeance. They might have encouraged him to stage acts of magnanimity, pardons, festivals, or public works that would recast him as a wise and merciful ruler in the eyes of the realm. Instead, they allowed his anger to fester, and with every execution and every burned man, the Mad King's image solidified in the minds of his subjects. The tragedy of the small council under Aerys II was not that it lacked capable men, but that it failed to act collectively, boldly, and early enough to counteract his decline. The Targaryens had the tools to avert disaster: a structure for governance, a roster of talented administrators, and the precedent of strong hands guiding weaker kings, but they did not use them. By the time the council realized the full scope of Aerys's madness, it was too late. His mind was closed to counsel, his trust irrevocably broken, and his cruelty unleashed without restraint. In a different world, the small council could have been the shield that preserved the dynasty. By uniting in purpose, managing the king's ego, controlling the flow of information, and insisting on procedural safeguards, they might have contained his dangerous tendency. Instead, they became passive witnesses to the unraveling of the realm, their silence and inaction allowing the flames of madness to spread until they consumed both king and kingdom. If Aerys II was the embodiment of instability, then Prince Rhaegar was, in many ways, his opposite. Where the father was impulsive, the son was deliberate. Where the king was ruled by paranoia and suspicion, the prince was thoughtful and introspective. Yet for all of Rhaegar's talents, his intelligence, charisma, and almost prophetic sense of destiny, he was never formally prepared to inherit the Iron Throne. His education was vast in the scholarly sense, but the political grooming that should have taken place was neglected, in part because of Aerys's own insecurities. This neglect, was one of the greatest missed opportunities in the history of the Targaryen dynasty. For if Rhaegar had been fully empowered to assume the role of king before his father's madness reached its peak, the rebellion that consumed the realm might never have occurred. From his earliest years, Rhaegar was different. He was bookish and contemplative, more at home with a scroll in his hand than a sword. The songs of bards and the dusty annals of history captivated him. There are tales of the young prince wandering the halls of the Red Keep with a solemn expression, as though he carried the weight of the realm even as a boy. One day, the story goes, Rhaegar simply appeared at the practice yard in armor, declaring that he must be a warrior. It was as if something in his readings had awakened him to a sense of duty, a realization that knowledge alone would not be enough to serve the realm. This self-driven shift in his character showed that he possessed both the discipline and the foresight to grow into a ruler who could blend wisdom with strength. Unfortunately, that natural inclination was never fully nurtured by the man who should have seen it as his dynasty's salvation, his father. Aerys viewed his son with a mixture of pride and suspicion. In the early years he seemed pleased with Rhaegar's diligence and talent, but as the young prince's reputation grew among the lords and small folk, Aerys's jealousy began to take root. He could not ignore the fact that many in the court and in the realm at large spoke of Rhaegar with admiration, that they did not extend to the king himself. Every noble who whispered that the realm might be better off with Rhaegar on the throne was, in Aerys's mind, plotting treason. Rather than recognizing the advantage of having a beloved heir, Aerys began to see his son's popularity as a direct threat. This suspicion meant that Rhaegar was kept at arm's length from the machinery of governance. He was rarely invited to small council meetings and had little influence over state policy. While he trained in arms and immersed himself in history, he lacked first-hand experience in the day-to-day politics of ruling the Seven Kingdoms. If the Targaryens had truly wished to avoid the disaster of Aerys's fall, they would have needed to place Rhaegar in positions of visible authority long before the rebellion loomed on the horizon. Making him master of laws, sending him as an emissary to restive regions, or placing him in command of key royal projects could have signaled to the realm that the Iron Throne's succession was secure, its future in capable hands. Such grooming would have served multiple purposes. It would have reassured the nobility that there was a plan for the realm's future, thus reducing the temptation for factions to plot their own paths to power. It would have given Rhaegar the chance to forge personal bonds with the great lords, relationships that could later be called upon in times of crisis. And perhaps most importantly, it would have created a public image of a royal family united in purpose, with father and son working in harmony for the good of the realm. Even if Aerys's behavior grew more erratic, the nobility might have been willing to endure it for the sake of the stability promised by his heir. Rhaegar's own character suggests he might have approached such responsibilities with a seriousness that could have steadied the crown's reputation. He had a deep respect for history and prophecy, but he also understood the practical needs of rule. His fascination with the legends of Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised was not idle fantasy. It shaped his belief in the importance of preparing for great challenges. The same foresight could have been applied to the political storms gathering in Westeros. With proper guidance, he might have seen the danger in his father's isolation and worked quietly to repair alliances, even before the crisis with Lyanna Stark erupted. But for this to happen, the royal household would have had to take deliberate steps to bridge the gap between father and son. Trusted intermediaries, perhaps Rhaegar herself, or a mutually respected figure like Barristan Selmy, could have framed Rhaegar's involvement in governance as a way to lighten the king's burdens rather than as a bid for power. By publicly affirming Rhaegar's loyalty and by giving him high-profile tasks under the king's authority, they could have calmed Aerys's fears while still allowing the prince to build the skills and relationships he would need. The absence of this preparation left Rhaegar in a dangerous position. When Robert's rebellion began, his personal reputation was strong, but his political base was far weaker than it could have been. Many lords respected him, but few were bound to him by shared governance or personal loyalty earned through years of cooperation. His actions during the rebellion, most notably his fateful decision to meet Robert Baratheon at the Trident, were guided more by his own sense of honor and prophecy than by the kind of calculated political strategy that experience might have taught him. Even in the final years before the war, there was a window in which the Targaryens could have staged a peaceful transition. Aerys's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. his decisions increasingly erratic and dangerous. If Rhaegar had already been positioned as a co-regent or a de facto ruler, the realm might have accepted his ascension without bloodshed. A quiet abdication engineered by a united small council, supported by the great houses and presented to Aerys as a necessary measure for the realm's safety, could have preserved the dynasty. With Rhaegar on the throne, it is possible that the events at Harrenhal and the scandal with Lyanna might have played out differently, or at least without sparking a full-scale rebellion. Instead, the lack of preparation meant that when the moment of crisis came, there was no clear path to replace Aerys without open conflict. The realm was forced into a choice between a mad king and a rebel coalition. Rhaegar, for all his gifts, entered that conflict without the political infrastructure that might have secured him a bloodless victory. His death at the Trident sealed not only his fate, but the fate of the entire Targaryen line in Westeros. The lesson is clear: the strength of a monarchy lies not only in the person of the king, but in the preparedness of the heir. Aerys's refusal to see Rhaegar as an asset rather than a rival robbed the dynasty of its most powerful safeguard against instability. By failing to groom his son for the throne, the Mad King ensured that when his own reign collapsed, it would drag his entire house down with him. A different path, one that embraced Rhaegar's talents, gave him real authority, and presented him to the realm as the rightful, capable successor, could have transformed the end of the Targaryen era into a story of renewal rather than destruction. The Iron Throne did not rest on dragonfire alone. Even in the days when dragons darkened the skies of Westeros, the Targaryen monarchy depended on the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the great noble houses that ruled the Seven Kingdoms in the king's name. After the death of the last dragons, the balance between crown and nobility became even more delicate. Without the overwhelming military supremacy of dragon riders, the Targaryens ruled by virtue of their legitimacy, their control of the royal army, and the complex web of political alliances woven through marriages, favors, and shared interests. By the time Aerys II sat upon the Iron Throne, these alliances were frayed, and his failure to repair them was one of the central reasons the dynasty fell when it did. In the earliest years of Aerys's reign, the relationships with the great houses were still functional, if not entirely warm. House Stark in the north maintained a respectful distance from the politics of the south, but they honored their oaths. House Targaryen in the Vale was stable and reliable under Jon Arryn's leadership. House Targaryen of the Reach was more than willing to work with the crown, their prosperity tied closely to royal favor. House Martell, though historically resistant to outside rule, had been brought into the realm through diplomacy and marriage, and was for the moment at peace. Even House Baratheon, though fiercely independent, had no particular quarrel with the throne. But the linchpin of the realm's stability was House Lannister, bound to the crown through the service of Tywin Lannister, as Hand of the King. At first, Tywin's effectiveness as Hand made the crown appear strong, masking any underlying weaknesses in the king's relationships with his vassals. However, the personal bond between Tywin and Aerys began to sour, and this private rift soon spilled over into the public sphere. Aerys, increasingly jealous of Tywin's competence and popularity, began to undermine him in subtle but damaging ways. Refusing to wed Prince Rhaegar to Tywin's daughter Cersei was the most visible slight, but smaller insults denying honors, questioning decisions, spreading hints of disfavor chipped away at the foundation of their alliance. With every petty humiliation, Aerys alienated not only Tywin but the entire Lannister power base, which had been a cornerstone of Targaryen stability for 2 decades. The deterioration of relations with the Lannisters was symptomatic of a broader failure. Aerys had no coherent strategy for managing the nobility. Instead of fostering loyalty through consistent respect, calculated generosity, and personal engagement, he approached his relationships with the great houses as a series of ad hoc encounters, lavishing favor one moment, showing open contempt the next. The great lords of Westeros were proud men, and even those who would tolerate the occasional insult for the sake of their own advantage grew weary when the slights became constant. By the later years of Aerys's reign, the loyalty of the nobility was held together more by inertia than by genuine allegiance to the crown. Had the Targaryens wished to prevent the Mad King's fall, they would have needed to make noble relations the central pillar of their governance. This would have meant more than simply avoiding insults. It would have required regular, deliberate efforts to bind each great house more closely to the crown through marriages, shared ventures, and mutual defense agreement. The royal family could have made annual progresses through the realm, visiting Winterfell, the Eyrie, Highgarden, Sunspear, and Storm's End, reinforcing the personal bonds between king and lord. Aerys could have made a public show of honoring the customs of each region, attending their feasts, hearing their petitions in person, and granting small but meaningful boons that reminded the lords and their bannermen that the Iron Throne was not a distant, alien authority, but a living partner in the governance of Westeros. Marriages would have been the most powerful tool for securing these alliances. By the time of Aerys's reign, the Targaryens had already lost the dragons that once justified their insular marital traditions, yet they clung to them stubbornly. Opening the royal family to alliances through marriage could have dramatically altered the political landscape. A match between Rhaegar and Cersei Lannister would have bound the realm's richest house to the crown in an unbreakable alliance. A younger prince or princess could have been wed to a Stark, bringing the North into closer partnership with the South. Even symbolic gestures, betrothing a royal cousin to a younger child of the Martells or Tyrells, would have sent a message of unity. The crown could also have solidified loyalty through the strategic granting of titles and lands. Aerys had opportunities to reward service in ways that cost him little but meant much to the lords who received them. Elevating a loyal bannerman of a great house could create a double layer of allegiance, one to the liege lord, and another directly to the crown. Similarly, resolving long-standing disputes in favor of a house's interests, when done judiciously, could generate goodwill that lasted for decades. The Starks, for instance, might have appreciated royal support in border disputes with the Wildlings, or the Ironborn. The Tyrells could have benefited from crown-sponsored trade agreements with Essos. The Martells might have welcomed the strengthening of Dornish autonomy within the framework of the realm. Even in times of peace, the perception of fairness in royal judgments was critical. Aerys's later tendency to let personal grievances dictate policy eroded the nobility's trust in the crown's justice. The great lords were willing to tolerate a certain level of eccentricity or even cruelty, but they needed to believe that the monarchy acted in the realm's interest, not merely in its own. Every arbitrary execution, every confiscation of lands without cause, chipped away at this belief. By contrast, consistent demonstrations of impartial justice, settling disputes without favoritism, punishing even allies when they broke the law, could have reinforced the legitimacy of Targaryen rule, even in the face of personal unpopularity. The defiance of Duskendale, and Aerys's reaction to it, stands as a turning point in this narrative. The king's captivity there was a humiliation, but it was also an opportunity to reassert royal authority in a way that balanced strength with mercy. Instead, Aerys chose vengeance, ordering the execution of Lord Darklyn and the destruction of his house. To some this might have seemed a display of power, but to the great lords, it was a warning that the king's wrath could fall upon anyone, without regard for precedent or restraint. In that moment, the king ceased to be a guarantor of noble privilege, and became a potential threat to it. The rebellion that would later unite half the realm against him was born from this recognition. Maintaining noble loyalty also required a degree of humility that Aerys lacked. Kings in Westeros were expected to recognize that while they ruled by right, they did not rule alone. Aerys's descent into paranoia made him increasingly unwilling to share the stage with his vassals. Grand events like the tourney at Harrenhal, which could have been used to strengthen bonds between crown and lords, became overshadowed by suspicion and political misstep. Rather than attending such gatherings with the intent to inspire loyalty, Aerys often used them as stages to assert dominance, or to humiliate perceived rivals. In doing so, he missed countless opportunities to shore up the fragile unity of the realm. By the eve of Robert's rebellion, the damage was done. The Starks, the Aerys and the Baratheons were united by blood through the marriage of Lyanna Stark's brother to Jon Arryn's ward, Robert Baratheon. The Lannisters, alienated by years of slights, stood apart, watching the unfolding chaos for their own advantage. The Tyrells and Martells, though not openly rebellious, were not invested in the survival of Aerys's rule. When rebellion came, there was no broad coalition of loyalists, ready to rally in the king's defense. There was only a patchwork of isolated supporters, none strong enough to stand alone, and none willing to trust Aerys enough to unite under his banner. Had the Targaryens taken noble relations seriously, treating them not as an afterthought, but as the foundation of their reign, the rebellion might never have gained momentum. A king who could call upon the personal loyalty of the great houses, reinforced by marriage ties, mutual favors and shared victories, would have faced his enemies with overwhelming strength. Instead, Aerys stood alone, a king in name but not in power, abandoned by those whose support he had squandered through arrogance, neglect, and cruelty. The Great Tourney at Harrenhal in the year 2081 AC has gone down in history as one of the most fateful gatherings in the history of Westeros. To most who attended, it was a spectacle, a chance for knights to win glory, for lords to display their wealth, and for alliances to be quietly negotiated in the shadows of feasts and lists. To historians and storytellers, it has become a prelude to tragedy, the stage upon which the final acts of peace in the Seven Kingdoms played out before the storm of Robert's rebellion swept it all away. Yet buried within the pomp and pageantry of Harrenhal was a genuine political opportunity, perhaps the last real chance to steer the Targaryen dynasty away from collapse. If handled differently, the events of those days could have altered the fate of Aerys II, preserved the crown, and averted the bloody war that followed. By this point in his reign, Aerys was already deeply mistrusted. His captivity during the defiance of Duskendale had shattered his mind in ways from which he never recovered. He had grown increasingly reclusive, obsessed with plots against him, and prone to cruel, irrational punishments. His once close relationship with Tywin Lannister, the Hand of the King, had withered under jealousy and resentment. The great lords of the realm were polite to his face but whispered behind his back, and many already looked toward Prince Rhaegar as the realm's best hope for the future. Harrenhal, on the surface, was simply a massive tourney sponsored by Lord Walter Wend, ostensibly to celebrate the coming of spring. But in truth, the tourney was rumored to have been part of a plan by Rhaegar himself, an attempt to gather the lords of the realm in one place, quietly assess the political mood, and perhaps lay the groundwork for replacing his father on the throne before disaster struck. This was the crux of the Harrenhal opportunity, for the Targaryens to use the event as a public and symbolic handover of power. Aerys's reign could have ended, not in the fire and blood of rebellion, but in a carefully choreographed transition. The tourney provided an unparalleled political stage. Nearly every great house was represented. The mood was festive, but politically charged. In such a setting, with the right framing, Aerys could have announced a gradual abdication in favor of his son, preserving his dignity while satisfying the nobility's hunger for stability. Even if abdication was too radical for Aerys's pride, Harrenhal could have been used to elevate Rhaegar publicly into a position of shared authority. Naming him Prince Regent or co-ruler in all but name would have reassured the lords that the realm's governance was in capable hands. Aerys could have declared that the burdens of kingship were to be lightened by the strength of his heir, presenting the arrangement as a father's wise provision for the realm's future. Such a move would have allowed Rhaegar to begin the work of repairing alliances, mending grievances, and restoring faith in the crown, tasks that Aerys was by then incapable of performing himself. The other critical advantage of Harrenhal was its role as a social nexus. In a less suspicious frame of mind, Aerys could have used the gathering to personally meet with the great lords, offering gestures of goodwill and renewing bonds that had frayed over the years. The Starks, the Aryans, the Baratheons, the Tyrells, the Martells, all were represented. The opportunity to drink wine together, exchange pleasantries, and perhaps offer marriage alliances was ripe for the taking. Aerys could have turned what was later remembered as a political fracture point into a reaffirmation of unity, a grand display that the Seven Kingdoms still stood together under the Targaryen banner. Instead, Aerys squandered the moment. He arrived at Harrenhal with his paranoia in full force, convinced that the tourney was a front for a conspiracy against him. The whispers that Rhaegar intended to use the event to rally the lords to his cause inflamed the king's suspicion. Rather than embracing the gathering as a means of reconciling with his subjects, Aerys treated it as a den of vipers. He alienated potential allies with coldness and scorn. His erratic behavior confirmed many lords' fears about his mental state, strengthening their quiet readiness to support his removal if the chance arose. Then came the moment that has been recounted endlessly in song and story, the final day of the tourney, when Rhaegar Targaryen won the lists and instead of crowning his wife Elia Martell as the Queen of Love and Beauty, placed the crown of winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark. This act, whether meant as a romantic gesture, a political signal, or something more complex, became the spark that lit the fuse of Robert's rebellion. For the king, it was yet another humiliation, his heir publicly slighting his lawful wife, who was herself a symbol of Dornish loyalty to the crown, and doing so in favor of a betrothed woman from the north. For the lords of the realm, it was an unmistakable sign that the royal family was fractured, its priorities unclear and its internal discipline weak. But even after this misstep, the Harrenhal opportunity had not yet entirely slipped away. Aerys could have intervened in the aftermath. To control the narrative, he might have smoothed over the insult to Elia by publicly honoring her, perhaps by declaring a grand royal gift to House Martell, or naming her to some symbolic position of influence in the court. He could have summoned the Starks and Baratheons privately to reassure them that no dishonor was intended toward Lyanna's betrothal, framing Rhaegar's gesture as an ill-considered flourish, rather than a deliberate provocation. By acting quickly and decisively, Aerys could have prevented the crown's image from deteriorating further. More importantly, Aerys could have used the fallout as leverage to bind the great houses closer together. Imagine if, instead of retreating into suspicion, he had proposed a marriage alliance at Harrenhal to directly link House Stark, House Martell, and the royal family in a way that would have made open conflict nearly unthinkable. Even a symbolic fosterage, sending one of Rhaegar's children to be raised in the north or the Vale, could have gone far in restoring confidence that the Targaryens were not isolated in King's Landing, but genuinely invested in the unity of the realm. The political capital of Harrenhal lay in the fact that it was a voluntary gathering. The lords were not summoned under threat or obligation, they came for celebration. In such a setting, hearts and minds could be won more easily than in the cold chambers of the Red Keep. Aerys's very presence there could have been reframed as a gesture of humility, stepping out from behind the walls of the capital to join his people in their festivity. For a king so plagued by rumors of madness, such a gesture paired with well-timed acts of generosity could have gone far in softening his image. Yet Aerys could not see the opportunity for what it was. His paranoia blinded him to the reality that Harrenhal was perhaps his last, best chance to reverse the tide of discontent. Instead of forging unity, the tourney became the backdrop to deepening division. Instead of elevating Rhaegar into a position that could assure the realm's stability, Aerys allowed their strained relationship to fester. Instead of repairing ties between houses, the events there worsened the fracture. The stage that might have hosted the peaceful renewal of the Targaryen dynasty became, in hindsight, the stage upon which its downfall began in earnest. When the dust of Harrenhal settled, the lords returned to their seats of power with more doubts about the Iron Throne than when they had arrived. In the weeks and months that followed, those doubts hardened into plans. Some whispered of rebellion, others quietly strengthened their alliances, preparing for the day when loyalty to the king would become a liability. In the north, in the Stormlands, and in the Vale, the seeds of resistance took root. In Dorne, the insult to Elia Martell was neither forgotten nor forgiven. The opportunity to rebind the realm through charm, diplomacy, and foresight had been squandered completely. The tragedy of Harrenhal is that it was not fated to be a prelude to war. It could have been remembered as the moment the Targaryen dynasty was revitalized, the moment a troubled reign transitioned gracefully into a promising new era under Rhaegar. Instead, it became the symbol of everything wrong with Aerys's kingship: his mistrust of his subjects, his failure to manage his heir, and his inability to seize the chances that fate placed before him. With different choices, Harrenhal could have been the turning point that saved the dynasty. Instead, it became the point of no return. In the history of the Seven Kingdoms, few political partnerships were as promising, and ultimately as ruinous, as that between King Aerys II, Targaryen, and his hand, Tywin Lannister. In their early years together, they were a formidable pair. Aerys, young and charismatic, embodied the splendor of royal power, while Tywin, shrewd and disciplined, brought a steel-edged efficiency to the governance of the realm. For over a decade, their combined rule ushered in a period of relative stability and prosperity. Roads were maintained, the royal treasury swelled, and the reach of the Iron Throne's authority extended into even the most stubborn corners of the Seven Kingdoms. But beneath this successful facade, tensions simmered, tensions that, left unresolved, would grow into one of the central cracks in the foundation of Aerys's rule. The role of the hand of the king was often described as the king's voice and will. A good hand could turn a weak ruler into a competent one, and a great hand could make a strong ruler's reign legendary. Tywin was, by all accounts, one of the greatest hands in living memory. His talent for administration was matched by his uncompromising sense of order. Corruption was rooted out ruthlessly. Taxes were collected efficiently, without ruinous burdens on the small folk. The crown's debts were paid down, until the realm stood in rare financial health. Foreign envoys spoke of King's Landing as cleaner and more orderly than it had been in generations. In the eyes of many, Tywin's stern but effective governance was proof that the Targaryens still commanded the realm with wisdom. And that perception was precisely where the seeds of disaster lay. For every noble who credited Aerys with the realm's stability, there were 3 who credited Tywin. The hand's prestige began to rival, and in some eyes, surpass that of the king. At first, Aerys tolerated this. Tywin's successes reflected well on the monarchy, and the king enjoyed the glory without having to engage in the tedious work of governance. But Aerys's insecurities, which had always lingered beneath the surface, began to take root. Whispers in the court that Tywin was the true power in the realm, whispers that were never far from the truth, fed the king's resentment. In a healthier political environment, such resentment could have been addressed directly. Aerys might have been counseled to see Tywin's competence not as a threat, but as an asset to be celebrated publicly. By framing every success as a joint achievement, king and hand in perfect accord, the perception of rivalry could have been replaced with one of unity. Public displays of camaraderie, honors bestowed upon Tywin with the king's own words of praise, and shared appearances at great events would have reminded the realm that the 2 men served as partners, not rivals. Instead, Aerys allowed the whispers to fester, and Tywin's pride, already considerable, made him ill-suited to play the role of humble servant in the face of public envy. The marriage politics between their families became the flashpoint. Tywin, as any ambitious lord would, sought to secure his house's future through advantageous marriages. The most obvious and politically potent match of the era was between his daughter, Cersei Lannister, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Such a union would have bound the realm's richest and most powerful house to the royal family, creating an alliance that would have been all but unbreakable. But Aerys, whether out of jealousy, paranoia, or sheer spite, refused the match outright. This was not merely a personal snub. It was a deliberate humiliation, a reminder to Tywin that he was a servant, not a peer. The rejection signaled to the realm that the bond between king and hand had fractured, and it humiliated the Lannisters in the eyes of other great houses. The refusal of the marriage proposal was more than a missed diplomatic opportunity. It was a turning point in the king's relationship with his hand. Tywin, for all his discipline, was not a man who forgave open insult easily. His loyalty to the Targaryen crown, while never entirely withdrawn, became more transactional. From that moment onward, he began to think not only of serving the realm but of safeguarding his family's power in the event that the monarchy faltered. In political terms, Aerys had converted his most valuable asset into a potential liability. Avoiding this rupture would have required both political foresight and personal humility. Aerys could have agreed to the match with Cersei and Rhaegar, framing it as a reward for Tywin's years of loyal service, and a testament to the unity of Crown and Westerlands. Such a marriage would have fused the realm's 2 greatest concentrations of wealth and influence. In the event of unrest, the Lannisters' loyalty would have been all but guaranteed, not merely through oaths, but through blood. Even if Aerys had been unwilling to tie his heir to House Lannister, he could have offered an alternative match, a younger Targaryen, or Valyrian, or even a royal cousin to demonstrate goodwill without compromising whatever private misgivings he held. Beyond marriage alliances, Aerys could have strengthened the bond with his hand by ensuring that Tywin's prestige was always tied to the king's own. Joint proclamations where both names were affixed to royal edicts would have reinforced the perception of unity. Public feasts or tournaments where Tywin was honored by the king in front of the court could have cemented the idea that their fates were intertwined. In private, Aerys could have sought Tywin's counsel more frequently, not to cede power but to create the appearance of mutual trust, an appearance that often becomes reality over time in politics. Tywin, too, could have been managed more carefully. The Lannister pride was legendary, and while Tywin was loyal to the monarchy, he was even more loyal to his family's standing, granting him honors that acknowledged his service without threatening the king's own stature, such as commissioning monuments in the king's name to commemorate Tywin's victories, could have allowed the Hand to feel valued, while keeping the focus on Aerys's authority. Small gestures, like giving Tywin ceremonial command over key events, would have cost the king little but reinforced the illusion of partnership. Instead, Aerys chose a path of calculated diminishment. He began to exclude Tywin from certain decisions, undermined his policies in public, and entertained rival advisors whose loyalty to the Hand was suspect. These decisions weakened not only Tywin's position but also the overall coherence of the royal government. The once efficient machinery of state began to grind under the weight of internal competition. Aerys's preference for petty victory over political unity meant that when rebellion finally came, the crown could no longer count on the unquestioned support of the Westerlands. The final blow to their relationship came when Aerys publicly humiliated Tywin by appointing Sir Jaime Lannister, Tywin's heir, to the Kingsguard. This stripped Tywin of his son and future Lord of Casterly Rock, effectively ending the Lannister line of succession through It was an unmistakable power play, Aerys's way of keeping the Lannisters in check by depriving them of their most direct path to generational stability. To Tywin, it was not only an insult but an act of war in all but name. From that moment, the Hand's loyalty to the Targaryen cause was fatally compromised. Had the bond between king and Hand been preserved, the course of Robert's rebellion might have been entirely different. Tywin's wealth, armies, and political acumen could have been decisive in crushing the uprising before it gained momentum. Instead, when the war reached its climax, Tywin stood back, waiting for the moment most advantageous to House Lannister. His eventual loyalty came not in the form of riding to the king's defense, but in opening the gates of King's Landing to Robert's forces, a betrayal disguised as an act of service. By then, the relationship between king and Hand was not merely strained, it was shattered beyond repair. The collapse of the Aerys-Tywin partnership is a reminder that in a feudal realm, personal relationships are political relationships. Aerys allowed pride, suspicion, and jealousy to undermine a bond that had been the strongest pillar of his rule. Preserving that bond would have meant swallowing personal slights, curbing paranoia, and placing the stability of the realm above the satisfaction of petty rivalry. In failing to do so, Aerys not only lost his greatest ally, he created the conditions for one of the most devastating betrayals in Westerosi history. By the spring of 2081-282 AC, the realm was a glass goblet already hairline cracked by Aerys II's paranoia, Targaryens, Lannisters, and decades of fraying alliances. What remained to shatter it was not a siege engine, but a story. A crown of winter roses, a vanished northern maiden, a wounded Dornish pride, and a storm lord whose honor had been publicly mocked. The elopement or abduction, depending on which banner one swore, of Lyanna Stark by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, was the personal scandal that ignited a political powder keg. Had the Targaryens handled this single storyline differently, the war that ended their dynasty might never have begun. Preventing that spark required neither dragons nor miracles. It required understanding what the act signified to each power center in Westeros, and then bending law, ritual, and narrative to douse the flames before they leapt into open rebellion. To Rhaegar, Lyanna was not merely a romantic infatuation. The prince read history and prophecy as if they were maps, and he believed his life's course was charted towards some great necessary convergence. He had a dutiful tenderness for Ilya Martell, but Ilya's precarious health and the pressures of succession turned his thoughts toward legacy and destiny. He was also a man of gestures. When he crowned Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty at Harrenhal, he believed himself speaking an elevated language of chivalry and omen. To Northern and Stormland eyes, however, he spoke a simpler tongue. He insulted a betrothal contracted in good faith, and publicly humiliated Robert Baratheon and House Stark. To Dorne he imperiled Ilya's dignity and their hard-won union with the Iron Throne. To Aerys, already raw from Duskendale and cocooned in suspicion, Rhaegar's discretion was not loyal silence but a conspiracy unfolding behind his back. The first step to preventing the rebellion, then, was to treat the matter as a political emergency the moment the roses touched Lyanna's lap. Not months later, when the girl was gone and outrage had calcified into calm. If Rhaegar intended a lawful redirection of his marital life, the Targaryen court needed to build a bridge of law before the prince set a single foot upon it. Westerosi custom is monogamous and hedged about by the faith, yet Targaryen history contained precedents that, while controversial, could be revived with care. A sovereign seeking to alter a royal marriage could petition the High Septon for an annulment on precise, sober grounds tied to succession and the safety of the line grounds. A Grand Maester and Master of Laws could frame as continuity, not caprice. Such a petition would have required public reasoning, documented consultation with Dorne, and a generous program of guarantees for Ilya, a richly endowed jointure, a permanent seat on the small council, and a formal declaration that her children, Rhaenys and Aegon, retain their princely dignities and place in the succession, unless and until a great council ruled otherwise. Ilya's honor, not merely her position, needed visible safeguard. Letters under the king's seal to Sunspear, coupled with a royal progress to Dorne to make offerings at the Water Gardens, would have turned affront into ceremony. Absent such steps, any private vow between Rhaegar and Lyanna was not romantic courage, but a political match struck in a granary. There was also a northern dimension to honor that the crown ignored at its peril. The north endures, but it does not forget, and what it will not forget most swiftly is a slight to keep. If the prince's heart was fixed, the crown should have treated Lyanna first as a daughter and only then as a princess in waiting. That meant bringing Rickard Stark into confidence early, not as a supplicant, but as a partner whose standing the Iron Throne acknowledged. A formal parley at Winterfell, or Riverrun, neutral, respectable ground, with Jon Arryn as mediator, could have recast a scandal as an awkward negotiation. The royal side would lay out its case, the needs of succession, the prince's declared intentions, the proposed dignities for Ilya, the settlements for House Stark, and a generous, face-saving compensation to Robert Baratheon. Such compensation could not be gold alone. Robert's wound was public, the salve had to be equally public. A new betrothal to a Targaryen kinswoman, or a noble bride of surpassing stature, a royal grant expanding Storm's End's ancient rights, and a conspicuous command in the royal host would let the Stormlord remain a storm without making him a hurricane. Managing Robert was not merely placation, it was coalition breaking. The rebellion's spine was an Arryn Stark Baratheon triangle. If the Baratheon node is softened or redirected, the triangle collapses into two lonely points. Jon Arryn loved his wards, but he loved the realm too. Give Robert a ladder down that preserves his honor, one he can climb in daylight while men cheer, and the Aerys old falcon may never take wing against the crown. That ladder had rungs, a proclamation affirming Robert's valor and loyalty, a royal tournament in King's Landing, where the king himself names Robert champion of the lists, and a joint feast at which Rhaegar publicly calls him brother. Pageantry properly deployed is policy. It converts the hot blood of insult into the warm wine of reconciliation. If instead, Rhaegar's feelings had outrun law and he and Lyanna had already fled, then the task becomes narrative seizure and de-escalation. Aerys' response, summoning the Starks by letter and then burning Rickard in his armor while strangling Brandon with a cord, was a masterclass in how to turn a private crime into a public crusade. The wiser course would have begun with a swift, royal assurance sent by Raven to Winterfell, Storm's End and the Eyrie. The Lady Lyanna is alive, safe, and in royal custody at a named, verifiable location. No harm shall befall her while the king's peace is on her. That phrase, the king's peace, is not poetry. Properly invoked, it is an institution. It signals a legal canopy under which hot-headed feuds are cooled into cases. Simultaneously, the crown would invite Rickard Stark to a closed court of honor, moderated by neutral lords, Hoster Tully foremost among them, where evidence and testimony could be weighed. If Lyanna declared consent, the law and custom of the faith could be addressed in that forum. If she declared coercion, then the prince becomes in the king's own mouth a transgressor answerable to crown and gods alike. Either path removes the premise for summary vengeance in the streets and replaces it with expectations and dates, which are the enemies of rebellion. In such a crisis, the master of whisperers becomes a fire brigade for rumor. Varys, or any competent spymaster, should have flooded taverns and septyards with the same three notes: the lady is safe, the king has ordered a lawful inquest, the prince will obey its findings. Swords sleep when people believe a process exists. Meanwhile, the Kingsguard should never have been transformed into a secret police shielding a love nest. Their white cloaks anchor legitimacy, To plant them at an undisclosed tower was to advertise to every raven in the sky that the law served romance, not the realm. The correct deployment kept those veterans visible beside the king, projecting order while discreet. Dependable household knights escorted Lyanna to conspicuous, honorable custody, a sept in Old Town under the Hightower's eye or the Eyrie under Lady Anya Waynwood, places no man would call dens of Targaryen coercion. Dorne's grievance was quieter but no less dangerous. The insult to Elia carried with it a political calculus the crown ignored. When a marriage binds a kingdom, an affront to the spouse affronts an entire region's dignity. To keep Sunspear from cooling into sullen neutrality, or flaring into vendetta, the Iron Throne needed to overcompensate. Rhaegar, if determined to alter his marriage, should have authored with his own hand an open letter praising Elia's courage and motherly virtue, witnessed by the Grand Master and sealed by Aerys. The king, for his part, should have raised Elia's household to near queenly state regardless of marital outcome. More guards, more say in the small council, more ceremonial preeminence. Let Dorne see that the crown need not love to honor, then pledge something only a king can give, a Dornish charter reaffirming their distinct laws and inheritance customs, re-engraved upon the realm's memory by a royal visit and public oaths. Such gestures would not erase hurt, but they would bankrupt rebellion by denying it. Dornish coin. Some argue that secrecy was the prince's only shield. In truth, secrecy was the oil on the kindling. Honorable men will swallow insult if they are given a stage to preserve their dignity. Deprive them of that stage, and they will build one on a battlefield. Rhaegar's choice to vanish Lyanna into shadow declared that no lawful stage existed, and so Robert, Eddard and Brandon resolved to build their own, to prevent that choice from hardening into legend. The Targaryens needed to turn each moment of furtiveness into an act of deliberate daylight. Aerys should have commanded Rhaegar to appear in the Red Keep within a fortnight under safe conduct, with a guarantee of sanctuary in the Great Sept while the faith weighed the matter. Rhaegar, if he meant to be king, should have obeyed at once, walking the city streets unarmed save for the armor of public candor. Kingship is often a performance of submission to rules one could in extremis shatter. The prince's refusal to perform that submission made it easy for his enemies to cast themselves as defenders of law rather than breakers of peace. There remained, too, the final instrument no one lifted until it was too late: abdication as medicine. Had Section 4's grooming been in place, Harrenhal's stage could have hosted a transition with Rhaegar ascendant and Aerys receding into gilded seclusion. In that scenario, the Lyanna matter might have been framed not as a prince's insolence, but as a king-in-waiting's admittedly unconventional betrothal, placed within a wider settlement that poured out honors upon Dorne and distinct compensations upon the north and Stormland. A great council convened with splendor could have been asked to confirm the line of succession and to rule narrowly on marital law as applied to the royal house. Great councils do not only solve crises, they launder them into memory. Had the Seven Kingdoms debated the matter beneath a canopy of banners instead of on fields of mud, a compromise would likely have emerged, one that kept Lyanna's person inviolate, Ilya's dignity intact, and Robert II publicly esteemed to lift a warhammer against a crown that had just embraced him. What of the moment when Brandon Stark, hot with outrage, rode to King's Landing demanding that Rhaegar come out and die? That was the crown's invitation to save itself. Here was a rash heir to Winterfell presenting the king with a perfect chance to demonstrate strength yoked to justice. Summon Brandon to the throne room, chide him for reckless speech, fine him heavily, and require, as satisfaction, a Stark oath to return with his father for a formal inquiry. No pyres, no strangulations, no wildfire murmurs, only the slow humiliation of legal process, at which Northers are the best in the world at gritting their teeth. Treat the Starks as angry men who will be heard, not as traitors who must be silenced, and their honor will compel them to hear you in turn. In doing so, you put time between outrage and action, and time is the ally of any regime that still controls the levers of spectacle, summons and seal. Even if pride and prophecy had pulled Rhaegar past all prudent thresholds, there remained one last firewall the Targaryens failed to raise: the deliberate fracturing of the would-be rebel coalition by cross-cutting loyalties. Arrange in haste what should have been planned in leisure. Offer a betrothal between baby Aegon and a Stark or Arryn girl. Pledge Rhaenys to a Tyrell boy.
Promise Robert the office of Warden of the East upon Jon Arryn's retirement. Confirm Hoster Tully's river customs by charter. Every new tie is a strand of hesitation woven into a lord's heart. Rebellion is not only a banner, it is a reckoning made in private chambers, where men ask themselves, who will stand with me when the crown calls my favors due? Make those favors heavy, recent and public, and you force even injured men to weigh their rage against their reputation. The bitter truth is that the Targaryens did not need to win love to avoid war. They needed only to deny their enemies a simple story. Aerys gave them the simplest: a mad king who murders fathers, a wronged fiancé with a hammer like thunder, a dutiful brother riding south to bring a sister home. The counter-story was available at every turn. The lady is safe and heard. The prince submits to inquiry. The queen is honored and enriched. The north is respected. The stormlands are celebrated. The faith deliberates. The law proceeds. None of these are romantic lines. All of them are stabilizing ones, told together, loudly and early. They might have smothered the legend before it gathered breath. In the end, the Rhaegar-Lyanna dilemma was not uniquely insoluble. It was uniquely mismanaged. The Targaryens mistook secrecy for prudence, vengeance for authority, and pageantry for vanity, rather than policy. They forgot that in a realm without dragons, legitimacy is not a birthright, so much as a performance renewed each season in courts, septs, and feasting halls. Had they remembered, the winter roses would still have been sung of, but as a curious flourish at the dawn of a careful settlement, not as the first petals falling on a dynasty's grave.
The Kingsguard, 7 knights sworn to don the white cloak, were more than an honor guard for the monarch. They were the living embodiment of chivalry. In Westeros, an ideal meant to reassure the realm that even the most absolute power would be checked by the vows of men whose loyalty was not to a man, but to the institution of the crown and the safety of the realm itself. Their oath was explicit: to defend the king, the queen, the royal family, and the innocent, to keep the king's secrets, to obey his commands, and to protect his life with their own. But bound up in that oath was a dangerous ambiguity. Did protecting the king mean protecting the person who happened to sit the Iron Throne at that moment, or protecting the very idea of the kingship and the people it ruled? In the reign of Aerys II, that distinction became more than academic. It became a matter of life, death, and dynasty. When the Targaryens still had dragons, the Kingsguard's role was largely ceremonial in peacetime. Their gleaming white cloaks and armor were meant to project an image of invulnerability. 7 of the greatest warriors in the realm, ready to cut down any who threatened the royal house. But after the dragons were gone, the Kingsguard's symbolic value grew even more important. They became the moral spine of the monarchy, the knights whose personal honor could compensate for a king's political missteps. Aerys II inherited a Kingsguard of capable men, some of them legends in their own right, like Ser Gerald Hightower, the White Bull, and Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. In another reign, such men might have acted as a steadying force. Under Aerys, their service became entangled with his paranoia, and their loyalty to the man, rather than the office, ultimately enabled his most dangerous excess. The Kingsguard's first great failure in Aerys's reign was allowing their role to contract from protectors of the realm into personal extensions of the king's will. When Aerys ordered executions without trial, burnings by wildfire for suspected treason, it was the Kingsguard who stood watch, their white cloaks flaring in the heat, silently validating the legitimacy of such acts. In the eyes of the realm, this transformed them from impartial defenders into accomplices. The white cloak, which should have been a badge of incorruptible virtue, became stained with the perception that the Kingsguard were tools of tyranny. This was not inevitable. The Kingsguard could have asserted the boundaries of their oath, refusing to carry out orders that clearly violated the realm's laws or custom. The history of Westeros offered precedent for this. In earlier reigns, Kingsguard knights had intervened to prevent a monarch from harming innocents, justifying their actions on the grounds that the king's will must be tempered by justice. The trick was in framing such defiance not as rebellion, but as service, reminding the king that a ruler's glory is magnified by mercy and diminished by cruelty. Aerys's Kingsguard, if united in that principle, might have steered his actions away from the extremes that alienated the great house. The tension between personal loyalty and institutional duty came to a head in the events surrounding Lyanna Stark's disappearance. When Rhaegar took her to the Tower of Joy, he left 3 of the Kingsguard's most formidable members, Geralt Hightower, Arthur Dayne, and Oswell Wend, to guard her. To the common observer, this deployment was baffling. Why would the kingdom's most elite bodyguards be stationed far from the king in a time of political crisis? The answer lay in a rigid interpretation of their vows. They were sworn to protect the royal family, and Rhaegar's blood and possible heir, if Lyanna was carrying his child, took precedence over the king's physical presence. But in doing so, they abandoned the monarch they were also sworn to defend, leaving Aerys in the hands of lesser protectors during the most dangerous months of his reign. This decision also had catastrophic symbolic consequences. To the rebels, the sight of the white cloaks absent from the king's side was proof that the Targaryen court was splintered. To the great lords, it suggested that the Kingsguard's loyalty could be selectively applied, guided by personal allegiance rather than the unified defense of the realm. And to Aerys himself, it may have deepened his paranoia, confirmation that even his most sacred protectors could be called away by another's command. A better approach would have been to clarify, long before such a crisis arose, the precise interpretation of the Kingsguard. That clarity should have been codified in public, not left to private tradition. The king and his council could have declared that in moments of internal conflict within the royal family, the Kingsguard's first duty was to the stability of the realm, meaning that at least a core contingent must remain with the reigning monarch at all times. The rest could be assigned to other members of the royal family as needed, but the king's safety and public authority would never be compromised. Such a proclamation would have preserved both the reality and the appearance of unity, making it harder for rebellion to find easy narratives about division at the heart of the crown. The Kingsguard also had another, often overlooked function. They were witness. In an era before printed proclamations or recorded trials, the presence of the white cloak was a form of living verification that events had occurred as the crown said they had. In moments of controversy, the word of a Kingsguard knight carried enormous weight. Aerys's Kingsguard could have leveraged this power to reassure the realm during his more erratic episodes. If, for example, the Kingsguard had spoken publicly, through formal declarations read at septs and keeps across the realm, that Lyanna Stark was safe, unharmed, and under honorable protection, the fury in the north and Stormlands might have been blunted. Instead, their silence allowed the rebels' version of events to dominate, unchallenged by any authoritative counter-narrative. Moreover, the Kingsguard were not only warriors, they were symbols of the highest ideals of knighthood. In times when a king's behavior threatened to alienate the realm, the Kingsguard could act as a moral counterbalance, showing through their conduct the virtues the crown claimed to embody. This might have meant making conspicuous acts of charity, honor, and justice on the king's behalf, reinforcing the idea that the monarchy still served the people's good even if the king himself appeared distant or erratic. The small council could have coordinated such acts, using the Kingsguard's public image to shield the crown from some of the reputational damage caused by Aerys's paranoia. The ultimate collapse of the Kingsguard's role came during the sack of King's Landing. When Tywin Lannister's forces entered the city under the guise of loyalty, the Kingsguard's sworn duty to protect the royal family met its harshest test. Mel Lannister, the youngest and least politically seasoned of their number, was the only white cloak present in the throne room when Aerys ordered the destruction of the city with wildfire. Shome's choice to kill the king and prevent that catastrophe saved countless lives, but it also broke the most fundamental tenet of his vows. In a realm with a clearer understanding of the Kingsguard's dual duty to the king and to the realm, the act might have been recognized not as kingslaying, but as the ultimate fulfillment of their purpose. Instead, Shome's deed became a permanent stain on his honor in the eyes of the world, a symbol of the Kingsguard's failure rather than its triumph. To avoid the Mad King's fall, the Targaryens needed a Kingsguard that was both fiercely loyal and politically self-aware, a body that understood its responsibility as guardians of the monarchy's legitimacy, not just its physical safety. This required careful selection of members, favoring not only martial skill but also political judgment and moral fortitude.
It required regular, visible integration into the governance of the realm, so that their loyalty was seen as loyalty to the entire system, not merely to one man's whims. And it required a conscious effort to keep them above faction, so that no one could say they were the tools of a prince against his father, or of a king against his heir. Had the Kingsguard been so oriented, had they been visible protectors of the realm's peace rather than the king's paranoia, they could have been an anchor in the storm, a stabilizing force around which the crown's other relationships might have been repaired. Instead, their white cloaks became, in the public mind, just another piece of the royal household's divided loyalties, another thread in the unraveling tapestry of Targaryen rule. The tragedy is that the Kingsguard were one of the few institutions that could have stood above the dynastic feud and reminded the realm of its common loyalty. By failing to claim that role, they allowed the Iron Throne to stand alone when the swords came for it.
By the early months of 2082 AC, the political weather around King's Landing was darkening into a full storm. Aerys II Targaryen's paranoia had alienated the great houses. His cruelty had eroded the people's faith, and the scandal of Rhaegar and Lyanna had turned long-simmering tensions into open fury. The king's reign had reached the point where his personal presence on the Iron Throne was actively destabilizing the realm. And yet even here on the very brink, there remained a path to preserve the Targaryen dynasty without fire and blood. A peaceful transition of power. It would have required political finesse, humility, and the will to frame abdication not as a defeat, but as a crowning act of statesmanship. If Aerys, or those closest to him, had recognized the moment, the Seven Kingdoms might have passed from father to son without the swords of Robert's rebellion ever leaving their scabbards. Abdication in Westeros was rare, but not without precedent. Several kings and lords in the realm's history had stepped aside, some to take the black, some to retire in peace, others to avoid civil war. The idea was not foreign to the political culture, though it carried risks to a ruler's pride. For a man like Aerys, whose self-image as the king had fused with his sense of identity, the very notion would have been an affront unless carefully framed. The key would have been to present abdication not as surrender to his enemies, but as a magnanimous gift to his heir and his people, a choice made from strength, not weakness. The message would need to be that the king, having secured the realm through decades of rule, was now passing the torch to ensure its continued stability. The groundwork for such a transition could have been laid as early as the tourney at Harrenhal, see sections. A public proclamation elevating Prince Rhaegar to the role of Prince Regent, entrusted with the day-to-day governance of the realm, would have normalized his authority in the eyes of the nobility. This would have allowed Aerys to retain the dignity of the crown while quietly shifting the burdens and the public scrutiny onto his son. Over months, as Rhaegar demonstrated his capability, the political logic for a full abdication would have grown irresistible. Nobles who feared Aerys's instability could be reassured that the succession was already in motion, while loyalists could comfort themselves that the king remained the symbolic heart of the realm. The transition itself could have been staged as a grand ceremonial event. The High Septon could be summoned to King's Landing to officiate, lending the imprimatur of the faith to the act. A great council could be called, ostensibly to reaffirm the line of succession, but in practice to formalize Rhaegar's ascension. The language of the ceremony would matter. The king entrusts the realm to his heir in fulfillment of his duty to the Seven and to the people. The act would be couched in religious devotion and paternal pride, not in political necessity. The optics would be of a king choosing the time and manner of his own departure, a king who still held enough authority to shape the future rather than be overtaken by it. In this scenario, Aerys's post-abdication life would have to be planned with care. Simply removing him from the throne without securing his comfort and dignity would invite resentment or even renewed scheming. The best course would be to grant him an honorable retirement at a secure and prestigious location, perhaps the Red Keep's royal apartments rebranded as his private court, or the summer palace at Dragonstone, steeped in Targaryen history. He could be styled as His Grace, Aerys the Wise or the Steadfast, titles that would soothe his ego while subtly reframing his reign in terms of wisdom gained through hardship. A retinue of loyal servants and guards drawn from families with a vested interest in maintaining the peace would ensure his safety and that of the realm. Rhaegar, for his part, would need to be more than a figurehead. To make abdication work, the new king would have to move quickly to repair the damage his father had done to the crown's relationship. That would mean public gestures of reconciliation with the great houses, especially those most alienated, the Starks, the Baratheons, the Aryans, the Martells, and even the Lannisters. Each would need a tailored approach, honors and commands for Robert Baratheon, diplomatic apologies and rights confirmations for Rickard Stark, a reaffirmation of marriage ties with Dorne, and a restoration of trust with Tywin Lannister through shared governance. The Lyanna Stark matter, so central to the rebellion's ignition, would have to be addressed immediately and decisively. If Lyanna were still with Rhaegar at the time of his coronation, the new king could have turned the scandal into a moment of unity by announcing a public and lawful settlement, either a formal marriage with her family's consent, accompanied by extraordinary honors to House Stark and House Martell, or her safe return to Winterfell with a public explanation that preserved her honor and Robert's. In either case, the focus would be on demonstrating that the new regime would not repeat the divisive secrecy and high-handedness of the old. Crucially, a peaceful transition would have denied the rebellion its central moral premise. Robert's rebellion was not merely about Lyanna, it was about removing a mad king whose continued rule was seen as intolerable. If that king had already stepped aside, much of the cause's rallying cry would have evaporated. Lords might grumble about Rhaegar's choices, but rallying an army against a newly crowned monarch who had just been ceremonially anointed by the faith, endorsed by a great council, and publicly committed to mending the realm would have been a far harder sell. The optics would be entirely different. Rebels would appear as aggressors, not liberators, and neutral houses would be more inclined to stand by the new king. There would, of course, be risks. Aerys might have chafed under the loss of power, scheming to reclaim. Hardline loyalists might have viewed abdication as dishonor, but these risks were far smaller than those posed by open war. Careful management of Aerys's environment, limiting his communication with potential malcontents, surrounding him with retainers loyal to Rhaegar, could have kept such dangers in check. Furthermore, the prestige of the act, if done with sufficient grandeur, could have become a point of pride for the Targaryens, proof that theirs was a dynasty strong enough to renew itself without bloodshed. The final image of Aerys II in this alternate history could have been of an elder statesman seated beside his son at great feasts, offering ceremonial blessings, occasionally advising on matters of tradition. He could have been remembered, if not as a great king, then at least as a king wise enough to step aside for the good of his house and his people. The war that in reality burned half the realm could have been replaced by a controlled transfer of power, leaving the Iron Throne unshaken and the dragon banners still flying over King's Landing. In truth, the possibility of a peaceful transition was always there. What was missing was the political will to take it. Aerys was too consumed by his own fears to imagine a future in which he was not the center of all power, and those around him, whether out of loyalty, cowardice, or ambition, failed to press the case. Yet history shows that monarchies endure not because kings cling to their thrones, but because they know when to pass them on. Had the Targaryens remembered this, Robert's rebellion might have been reduced to a footnote, and the Seven Kingdoms might have entered a new Targaryen golden age under Rhaegar, rather than an age of ashes under Robert.